Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Find a place where you feel at ease, where the weights of the day can be set down. Let your shoulders soften and your breathing find its own quiet rhythm. There is nothing else you need to do right now but to rest and to listen. We are about to travel back in time together, not to the loud and clamorous dates you might find in a textbook, but to the quiet, forgotten corners of history. We're journeying to a shadowed room in a grand palace, a place where secrets were heavier than any crown, and whispers could shape the fate of a nation. This is a story about the fragility of the human heart, hidden behind the gilded mask of absolute power. So, if you feel comfortable doing so, close your eyes. Allow your mind to drift on the sound of my voice, back through the years, back through the centuries, to a cold night in Madrid in the year 1834. The king is dead. Throughout the sprawling palace of Madrid, a profound silence has fallen, a quiet so deep it seems to absorb all sound. The usual bustle of courtiers, the distant clatter from the kitchens, the sharp reports of the royal guard, all have been muted by the finality of death. But for you, the royal physician, your work is not yet done. You have been summoned to the late king's private chambers for a task so strange, so unprecedented, that the royal decree in your hand feels like a script from a fever dream. You walk through corridors that feel colder than usual. Servants press themselves against the walls as you pass, their eyes downcast, their faces pale, masks of fear and uncertainty. You reach the heavy oak doors of the king's chambers. The guards nod grimly, and the wood groans as you enter. The air inside is thick with the scent of spent candles and medicinal herbs. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stands near the hearth, a lone figure draped in black. Her face is etched with a grief that seems too complex for simple sorrow. Her eyes, red from weeping, meet yours, and in them you see not just the pain of a widow, but the weary resolve of someone who must now manage a final, terrible secret. Her request is spoken in a whisper, yet it lands with the force of a thunderclap. Your hands, usually so steady during the most delicate of procedures, begin to tremble. You approach the grand four-poster bed where the body of King Ferdinand VII lies. Even in the stillness of death, the man who had terrorized Spain for decades seems to possess a formidable presence. But it is not his face, now peaceful in repose, that commands your attention. It is what lies beneath the layers of fine silk sheets. It is the origin of it all, the source of his legendary cruelty, his suffocating paranoia, his endless betrayals, the physical burden that defined his reign as much as any law he passed or any war he waged. An anatomical flaw, a cruel jest of nature that historians would whisper about for centuries but never dare to commit to the official record. As you begin the delicate, surreal process of preservation, your mind drifts back through the years, piecing together the hushed stories, the fragmented rumors, the knowing glances you've seen exchanged in the palace. Stories of horrified young wives, of desperate attempts to produce an heir against impossible odds, of a man broken by the very blueprint of his own body. You realize, with a chilling clarity, that you are not merely preserving flesh, you are preserving the physical emblem of a reign that was itself misshapen, disproportionate, and ultimately ruinous to everything it touched. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first understand that he was born under a shadow, not the curse of a witch or the wrath of a god, but the far more patient and poisonous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs, and later the Bourbons, had spent generations turning their family tree into a tangled wreath, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces. They did this to consolidate power, to keep their vast territories within a closed loop of blood. But this obsession with purity created the opposite, a poisoned chalice from which their descendants were forced to drink. The famous Habsburg jaw was but the most visible symptom of a deeper genetic decay. Ferdinand was the tragic culmination of this fatal inheritance. Born in the grand, somber palace of El Escorial on October 14, 1784, he was the son of King Charles IV and Maria Luisa de Parma, who were themselves first cousins. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way imaginable. As he grew from a boy into an adolescent, it became clear that nature had played a particularly cruel joke on the future king. His body began to develop in ways that defied medical understanding, in ways that were a source of quiet alarm among the court physicians. By his teenage years, the whispers about the royal anomaly were a constant, corrosive melody in the palace. A gift, some courtiers would jest with a cruel smirk, a curse the boy's tutors would murmur with pity. The psychological impact on young Ferdinand was catastrophic. In an era that judged male anatomy by classical Greek standards, where refinement was prized, his form marked him as a grotesque. The very thing that might be envied in a different time became the source of a profound, all-consuming shame for the future king of Spain. This secret became the dark sun around which his entire personality would orbit. His childhood was a masterclass in dysfunction that would have broken a stronger spirit. Instead, it forged a tyrant. His father, King Charles, was a weak-willed and simple man, far more at home on a hunting expedition than on the throne of a global empire. His mother, Marie Louisa of Parma, was a woman of voracious appetites who openly flaunted her affair with the Prime Minister, Manuel Godao, the true ruler of Spain. Day after day, young Ferdinand watched his father's humiliation, his mother's infidelity, and Godao's arrogance. He absorbed bitter lessons about power, betrayal, and the folly of trust. But it was his own physical secret that truly shaped him. He learned to see mockery everywhere, in the respectful bow of a servant, in the formal address of a tutor, in the arranged smile of a potential bride. His paranoia was not entirely unfounded. People were laughing at him, but he imagined the laughter was louder and more constant than it was. This constant humiliation cultivated a deep, festering resentment within him, a wound that would never heal and would in time bleed all over the nation of Spain. He grew secretive, vindictive, and cruel. His tutors noted a disturbing change as he entered adolescence. He took pleasure in the small torments of those who served him. One incident, recorded in the private memoirs of a court chaplain, reveals the darkness taking root. A young page, no older than 12, accidentally walked in on the prince while he was changing. He did not simply dismiss him. He had the boy publicly flogged and his entire family exiled from Madrid.
The message was sent with brutal clarity. No one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished.
As he reached marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became a matter of state crisis. The secret notes of his personal physician provide a disturbing glimpse into the medical reality. The configuration of the prince's body, he wrote, defied natural proportion and presented a most unusual challenge, making normal intimate relations a near impossibility without significant, almost clinical intervention. The royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called marital aids, specially designed cushions and supports that might allow Ferdinand to function without causing serious injury to his future wife. He became obsessed with finding a cure. He summoned alchemists and foreign physicians to the palace in the dead of night, each promising miracle remedies that inevitably failed. The prince spent a fortune on these quack potions. He consumed bizarre mixtures of ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and rare herbs, all meant to regulate his royal essence. He was desperate, and his desperation made him an easy mark for every charlatan and con artist in Europe. In 1802, at the age of 18, he was married to his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. She was a beautiful and intelligent girl who arrived in Madrid with a heart full of romantic notions. She had heard he was called El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters, and she imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding ceremony was a magnificent spectacle, as befitted the union of two great royal houses. The cathedral was filled with the soaring sounds of the choir, the streets of Madrid echoed with celebrations, and the young couple, standing at the altar, looked every inch the perfect royal pair. But wedding nights end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. Special preparations, he explained, were needed for the royal bedchamber. Custom-made cushions were brought in, along with bottles of oils and various implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, understood none of it. Her education was in languages, music, and courtly etiquette. The realities of married life had been explained to her in only the vaguest of terms. When Ferdinand finally entered the bridal chamber, her fairy tale shattered. The sight of her husband's true form sent her into hysterics. A lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as if she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. What followed was less a wedding night than a medical procedure. The king's physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified princess what would be required of her. The custom cushions were arranged, the oils applied, and a process began that was more akin to a clinical trial than an act of love. The psychological impact was devastating. Ferdinand's paranoia, already deeply rooted, was watered by his wife's obvious revulsion. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, developed what we would now recognize as severe sexual trauma. She sought refuge in laudanum, an opiate tincture that allowed her to drift away from the horror of her marital duties. Their attempts to produce an heir became a ritualized nightmare.
a routine of clinical preparations, of silent endurance, followed by a retreat to separate wings of the palace. Miraculously, Maria Antonia did become pregnant on 2 occasions. The court rejoiced, Spain held its breath, but both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages. The court physicians wrote diplomatically of the unusual stresses placed upon the Queen's delicate constitution. Ferdinand, incapable of compassion, showed the true depths of his cruelty. He became convinced that his wife was deliberately sabotaging their chances. He accused her of taking potions to prevent pregnancy, of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide Spain with a proper Catholic heir. These accusations destroyed what little remained of Maria Antonia's spirit. She began to believe she truly was cursed. When she died in 1807, at the age of just 21, the official cause was listed as a fever. The truth was far darker. She had died of despair, her body and mind broken by years of trauma, drug addiction, and psychological abuse. In private, Ferdinand seemed almost relieved. Within weeks, he was already making inquiries about a second wife. His personal trauma had now fully curdled into political monstrosity. He learned to see everyone as a tool. His first wife was a tool that failed. His subjects were tools for maintaining his power. Anyone who opposed him was an obstacle to be crushed. This mindset fueled his political machinations, including the infamous El Escorial conspiracy, where he plotted to overthrow his own father. When the plot was discovered, Ferdinand, in an act of supreme cowardice, betrayed every single one of his co-conspirators to save himself. It was a pattern he would repeat for the rest of his life. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and forced Ferdinand to abdicate, the king found himself a prisoner in France for 6 long years. It was a unique humiliation. He was a captive whose most shameful secret was undoubtedly known to his captors. During this time, French physicians studied his condition with a cold, scientific curiosity, conducting examinations that bordered on torture in their thoroughness. Their clinical reports, discovered centuries later, provide the most detailed descriptions of his anatomy ever recorded. And while these doctors probed and measured him, brave Spaniards were fighting and dying in the bloody Peninsular War to restore him to the throne. Ferdinand, meanwhile, spent his captivity writing letters across Europe, searching for a new bride who could endure his special circumstances. When he finally returned to Spain in 1814, he was greeted by euphoric crowds. They saw him as a savior. El Deseado returned. He smiled and waved, but his mind was on one thing: finding a new wife. His second choice was another cousin, Maria Isabel of Portugal. The wedding night was a repeat of the first disaster, a nightmare of terror and pain from which she never recovered. She became a ghost in the palace, flinching at his touch, until she died in 1818 after a horrific childbirth that also claimed the life of their infant daughter.
By now, Ferdinand's reputation was becoming legendary across the courts of Europe. Finding a third wife proved difficult. Eventually, his agents found Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, whose family's desperate financial situation made them willing to overlook the rumors. She was older, more worldly, and approached the marriage not with romantic hope, but with a grim, clinical determination.
Their 10-year marriage was a loveless, medically supervised ordeal. They were two scientists in a lab, attempting to solve an impossible equation. The pressure of this constant failure paralyzed the Spanish government. Cabinet meetings were postponed, and state decisions delayed for weeks, while the king consulted with his physicians about new marital techniques. Spain, once the center of a global empire, was now a laughingstock, its decline symbolized by a ruler whose most intimate failings were public knowledge. Then, after a decade of failure, the impossible happened. Maria Josefa Amalia became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through Europe. Ferdinand was consumed by a mixture of euphoria and terror. He placed his wife under constant guard, convinced that enemies would try to sabotage the pregnancy. But the tragedy was inescapable. The baby, a daughter, was born prematurely and lived for only a few hours. Maria Josefa died 3 weeks later. At the news of this double tragedy, Ferdinand's sanity finally shattered. For nearly a week, he refused to allow the bodies of his wife and daughter to be buried, demanding that his physicians perform impossible resurrections. The palace filled with the stench of decay as the king raged against reality. But fate had one final cruel joke to play. His advisors, desperate to secure the succession, arranged a fourth marriage to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. What they did not tell the king until it was too late was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The wedding, in 1829, was a farce. The queen walked down the aisle visibly pregnant with a child that could not possibly be the king's. But Ferdinand, now 45 and utterly broken, willingly embraced the deception. He was so desperate for an heir that he accepted this lie as a divine miracle. The birth of the future Queen Isabella II in 1830 should have been a triumph. Instead, it was the source of his final torment. He knew the child was not his, yet he had to maintain the fiction of her legitimacy. His final years were consumed by a grotesque paranoia. He had peepholes drilled into the walls of his wife's chambers, spending hours spying on her, watching her nurse the child that was both his heir and a constant reminder of his failure. He subjected his food tasters to grueling rituals of suspicion, and his midnight raids on the Queen's chambers, searching for imaginary conspirators, became the terror of the court. His mind, like his body, had become a prison from which there was no escape. As 1833 dawned, his physical health finally gave way. He began to fade, his body surrendering to a lifetime of stress, frustration, and psychological torment. He died as he had lived, a source of suffering for everyone unfortunate enough to be touched by his power. The secret autopsy confirmed the whispers of a lifetime. The king's preserved organ was a testament to nature's capacity for cruelty, but it also revealed something more tragic: evidence of self-harm, of decades of pathetic, secret attempts at self-surgery. A king trying to carve normality into his own flesh with whatever crude tools he could find. His legacy was a fractured Spain, a kingdom torn apart by civil war and economic collapse, inherited by a daughter who may or may not have been his. The story of Ferdinand VII is a chilling reminder of how the private, secret brokenness of one person in power can radiate outwards, becoming the public, open wound of a nation. And so, as that physician in 1834 completed his somber task, he must have reflected on the terrible irony. The object he held was more than a medical curiosity. It was a monument to how shame can corrupt power, and how the private pain of a single man can become the suffering of millions. The history of Ferdinand VII is a chilling reminder of how the most fearsome monsters are not always those from fairy tales, but those hidden within the fragile human mind. Our journey into the past comes to a close, and the silence returns once more to the royal chamber. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment, and for listening to this echo from a time long gone. I hope this story has given you a space for reflection, a departure from the here and now. May your thoughts be peaceful and your dreams be deep. Until our next story, rest well.